Russia and Belarus are preparing sabotage military operations by special forces against critical infrastructure in Poland and are preparing to launch additional drone incursions into European countries, blaming Ukraine for these attacks. The Institute for the Study of War made this assessment. Russia is already preparing for a military operation in Europe using a false flag. Besides preparing their military, the Russians have started anti-Ukrainian information campaigns in Poland and Germany. Analysts say Russia is planning provocations in Moldova following the total failure of pro-Russian forces there. And, as analysts assure, the Kremlin has created the informational conditions to spark protests in Moldova as early as the end of November 2025. In this episode, we will discuss the signals that Moscow itself is sending about preparing military operations in Poland, for which it then wants to blame Ukraine. My name is Alexei Pecci. Today is October 1st. And before we begin, I want to remind you that several news analysis segments are released every day on this YouTube channel. So that you stay up to date with absolutely all the news, I recommend you subscribe to this YouTube channel, and I ask you to like and leave any detailed comment under this video. This really helps promote the episodes on YouTube. So the Institute for the Study of War has noted that the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service baselessly claimed on September 30 that Ukraine is preparing to carry out a false attack on critical Polish infrastructure in order to frame Russia and Belarus. The Russian Foreign Intelligence Service stated that the main Directorate of Military Intelligence of Ukraine and Polish intelligence will send a sabotage and reconnaissance group to Poland consisting of civilians, citizens of Russia and Belarus, from the pro-Ukrainian Freedom of Russia Legion and the Kastus Kalinowski Regiment. The Foreign Intelligence Service claimed that the troops would present themselves as Russian and Belarusian special forces at a press conference after being captured by Polish security forces, and that the pro-Ukrainian forces will blame Russia and Belarus for the incident. Well, so the supposed scheme is that real Russians and Belarusians from the Kastus Kalinowski Regiment and the Freedom of Russia Legion are operating under the cover of Polish intelligence. They'll go in, act, get arrested, and won't admit they're Russians or Belarusians. The Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia stated that Ukraine might simultaneously carry out a so-called attack on critical infrastructure in Poland to increase public resonance. In addition, the Foreign Intelligence Service stated that Ukraine is trying to take advantage of the recent drone incursions into airspace in order to fuel anti-Russian sentiment in Poland, accelerate the escalation of the war, and encourage European countries to intervene in the war on Ukraine's side. So in other words, Russian thugs themselves are launching drones at European countries. Then the Foreign Intelligence Service says that Ukraine is trying to take advantage of these incidents. According to analysts, the Kremlin may have ordered the Foreign Intelligence Service to publish this statement to avoid responsibility for a possible future sabotage operation by Russia and Belarus against Poland. And it's worth noting here that earlier the Russian Foreign Ministry claimed that the 19 drones that attacked Poland on September 10 were also allegedly launched by Ukrainians. Here in the comments under my episodes, these unintentionally brainwashed people show up. Russians from the swamps claim it's long been proven these were Ukrainian drones, etc. And now, the press alcoholic of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Mashka Zakharova, told us that supposedly there is evidence that the armed forces of Ukraine intercepted several Garan drones, repaired them, and launched them at Poland. Of course, she didn't provide the supposed evidence. In addition, today photos appeared online from Berlin, where flyers calling for people to fight in Ukraine have appeared. The flyers feature a photo of German prisoners of war from World War I and a QR code that leads to the official website of the Ukrainian International Legion. It is noted that the first such announcements appeared back on September 19, hung for several days and then disappeared. It is unknown who put them up. Well, it's likely that Russian agents are behind the campaign, trying to discredit Ukraine and play on the sensitive topic of Nazism for Germans. Overall, it's important to remember that the Kremlin often uses the Foreign Intelligence Service to spread unfounded claims about planned attacks as part of disinformation campaigns aimed at weakening support for Ukraine and sowing doubt about the nature of Russia's provocations against NATO member states. The Kremlin is likely creating informational conditions to blame Ukraine for future attacks that Russia itself may carry out against Poland or other NATO countries. Let me remind you, on September 26, Russia similarly accused Ukraine of carrying out recent drone incursions into the airspace of Poland and Romania in order to provoke a war between NATO and Russia. Despite the fact that Polish and Romanian officials attributed these incursions to Russia, and despite the fact that the head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, stated that Russia has long been at war with NATO. He claimed NATO and the European Union using Ukraine as a proxy declared war on Russia, so Russia is fighting them. In general, if you dig into this Russian propaganda, you can really go crazy. But some Russians genuinely believe this. Analysts from the Institute for the Study of War say Moldovan politicians linked to the Kremlin may call for protests in the coming weeks before authorities approve the September 28 parliamentary election results. The Kremlin-linked Patriotic Bloc already stated on September 30 that the Moldovan authorities allegedly committed a blatant violation during the elections, and that the bloc will seek justice through street protests in the courts and, if necessary, in the country's constitutional court. Kremlin-linked Moldovan politicians stated on September 29 that they would challenge the election results on the grounds of alleged violations. Then things took off from there. High-ranking Kremlin officials continue to support the statements of Kremlin-linked Moldovan politicians about alleged fraud and violations in the elections. And then on September 30, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that the elections were rigged and that the Moldovan authorities had clearly manipulated the votes. One might wonder, why would someone like Lavrov care about what is happening in another country at all? But that's the Russians for you. They simply can't live without sticking their nose where they're not wanted. Moving on. The chairwoman of the Federation Council of Russia, Valentina Matvienko, stated on September 29 that Moldova's president Maya Sandu forced the Party of Action and Solidarity to a parliamentary majority, calling the elections illegitimate. It's unclear what bayonets she used to achieve this. And here's the most interesting part. Matvienko made this statement again. She's a Russian, an unwashed Russian woman who has absolutely nothing to do with Moldova. This is Matvienko saying, "The citizens of Moldova do not recognize these elections. Who are you?" So Matvienko, who are you and why are you making that statement? What's next? The official representative of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mashka Zakharova, states that the elections were unprecedentedly dirty and that the Moldovan authorities used extrajudicial mechanisms, blackmail, and threats. Jinping is taken half. The entire Kremlin apparatus is practically shaking because they couldn't push their pro-Russian politicians into Moldova, so now they're sticking their nose into Moldovan politics. Moldovan law requires the Central Election Commission to report parliamentary election results within 5 days and submit it to the Constitutional Court within 1 day by October 4. The Constitutional Court must then confirm or declare the elections invalid within 10 days, that is, by October 14. Candidates in the elections can petition the authorities for a recount of votes until the court approves the results, that is, until October 14. The Constitutional Court can declare the elections invalid if it finds a violation of the Electoral Code during the election process or the vote counting. That is why it is now obvious that the Kremlin is creating conditions for the emergence of possibly even violent protests with the aim of removing Maya Sandu from power after the elections and may start protests to challenge the election results. The Kremlin may still be planning to incite violent protests even if the Constitutional Court of Moldova approves the results. And perhaps in order to create such a Kremlin-initiated mirror copy, as analysts from the Institute for the Study of War write, a mirror copy. The 2014 Euromaidan pro-European protests in Ukraine led to the ousting of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. The Kremlin has set the stage for protests in Moldova as soon as late November 2025. Europeans should closely watch what's being said here and, importantly, observe the actions of the unwashed Russians. They will obviously continue trying to destabilize Europe, blaming everything on Ukraine, for example. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Especially Russians who come here. Write your bile that comes from you. Write it in the comments. You'll be useful. You know very well who you'll be useful to. Subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Bye, everyone.